I've often wondered the role of my gender in covering these stories, in uncovering or unlayering the truth. And that's what I'm here to talk about. Does a reporter's gender matter? It's a very simple answer, yes. It matters who reports a story. It matters whose voice is included in a story. It matters who edits a story. It matters who heads the newsroom and makes the key decisions. One of my first investigative stories back in 2013 was the rape and murder of a young teenage girl. Now, this is about 150 kilometers from the national capital, Delhi, when this young girl, she was cycling her way to her school to write her exam, and that's when she was attacked by a group of upper-class men in her village. Now, in flashback, I remember interviewing the family members, the men and the women separately. In many parts of Haryana, men and women don't share the same spaces. So I first interviewed the men of the family, including the girl's father. They were sitting in a veranda. They gave me details on the place, time, and date of the murder. And then I go to the room full of women. They were sitting on the floor. Many of them were crying. I went and I sat with them on the floor. And the mother, the sister, the aunts, and the neighbors of the girl who was murdered described to me the mutilated state in which they saw their little girl's body when it was taken to the hospital for autopsy. Now, while the careless police investigation and 3 autopsies ruled out rape before murder, but the information that I got from interviewing these women opened a little window to hint at sexual abuse before she was murdered. Now, if I were a male reporter, and no matter how good, I would not have had the access to these women. They would not have opened up to me. And I say this because at one point I had to ask my cameraman to leave the room so they could describe to me what they saw. Then the narrative of the story would have been very different from what I was able to capture. Now let me take you to a very typical television newsroom where most of the editors, the decision makers, happen to be men. It's a global phenomena, by the way, but for now I'm going to stick to India and my newsroom in particular. The editor-in-chief, the managing editor, the executive editor, the input editor, the output editor, the assignment editor, all men. And most of the times, many of these bosses have a very paternal, a very protectionist attitude towards female field reporters in particular, and this is something that many women face in their homes. Are you sure you'd be able to handle this assignment? What if things get out of hand? What if you get grabbed or groped? In the early years of my career, I had to convince my editors that I'm not delicate and that I don't want a delicate assignment. And I had to often argue with them and at times fight with them to get a dirty assignment. I'm a journalist. It's my job to get dirt under my nails. Now, journalism is dry. It's cutthroat. It's immensely competitive. It's everything that would be perceived to be a man's job. So what happens is that for the editors, a male reporter becomes the default choice to be sent on ground zero, and especially when it's about a story from a conflict-affected area. What the editors sometimes ignore is the fact that women and children are the worst sufferers of any conflict. And that story can be told from different gendered perspectives, and that impacts the representation of the larger truth. And that's why we need more female news managers, bosses, to be at the top of the hierarchy. Now, after many years of convincing, of sometimes arguing, and most importantly, proving myself, I get the dirtiest of assignments now. So this is in February last year that I went to report from the line of control and the international border in Jammu and Kashmir post the Pulwama attack by Jaish-e-Mohammed, and then the surgical strike by India on Pakistan. Now, while most news channels were reporting this story in facts and figures, what I went there to do is to tell the human side of the story. People living on the villages of the border, their lives were completely disruptive. Now, while my story navigated through very intimate and domestic nuances of living with military hostilities, there was another layer to the story. So for this particular assignment, I may have miscalculated my periods date, or I may have overstayed my visit, but I got my periods. What am I going to do now? Everything is shut. The markets have been shut for weeks, and at this point, me and my cameraman are not even sure whether we'll get a hotel or if we'll have to spend the night in the car. So I asked Kanta. She was one of the women that I interviewed, and I asked her if she has a sanitary pad that she can lend to me. She didn't have one. She barely had enough food stocked up. But Kanta and her daughter made sure that I get on with my job. And they left their grief aside, and they made a pad for me. They made a pad for me using some cotton, a layer of cloth, and some straw. They even gave me some extra raw material for later. Now, in everyday lives, women lend each other pads, and in workspaces and in schools, women who don't even know each other do it for each other. It's like an unspoken code between women. But in a conflict-affected area where the lives of these women is already in a state of disarray, it felt beautiful that this code was kept up. Now, as a female journalist, I've often noticed that young girls are curious or in awe of me or my work or both, and especially in rural areas. This is Rajasthan-Haryana border. I was shooting a documentary on lynching, and I was interviewing a series of these men, and we were sitting on a charpai, which is a bed, a cot, and I saw this girl. She kept following me, and she kept smiling at me. That's her, the one who's covered her face. Her name is Noor. She's about 16 years old. So she walks up to me when I'm wrapping up my shoot, and she says to me, "Didi, how is it that you were sitting with these men on a charpai, right next to them, even the sarpanch, and asking them questions?" So I didn't understand what she was asking me. I asked her what she means, and she tells me that in her village, women don't sit on the top of the charpai. They either sit on the floor or they're in the kitchen away from where the men sit. That's when I thought how prevalent these gender-based power structures are. Be it newsrooms or villages, it's the men that get to decide who's going to sit on the top or who's going to report a story. But at that moment, uh, Noor realized that the structure could be broken and that things could be otherwise, that she doesn't have to sit on the floor and that she could also sit on the top. I meet, I meet hundreds of people in the field, and I only give my number to a potential source, understandably. But when Noor asked me for my number, I gave her. And I get a call from her months later, and she calls from a, I think she called from a neighbor's phone, and she called and she said, Didi, now I also sit on the charpai right next to my brother and my father. And I said, my God, Noor, how did you do that? So she tells me that it wasn't very difficult, and that she, with a bit of resistance in the beginning, she could just do it. And she never thought of doing it because all the other women in her village don't. Though it was a little change, but in her world, it was a big step towards gender equality. Stories are never flat. There's a lot that happens behind the scenes that goes on, that goes beyond what you really see on the screens. And it is these little but important conversations and the strength that women draw from women that shape both the reporter and those being reported. I'm going to end with this thought. Whatever is perceived as your weakness, as your vulnerability, is really your strength. You just have to embrace it. Thank you.